I want to begin tonight by starting at 30,000 feet and talking a little bit just generally without Makora about what we've been looking at really for the last number of months. We've taken a different turn in this year from where we were for pretty much a decade for most of Masechet Yoma, if not all of Masechet Yoma, and for much of Masechet Sukka. And that is because the third parak of Masechet Sukka, of Lulav HaGazul, contains within it several key sugyot that animate a lot of the lumdus, the discussions between the Rishonim and the Achronim to try to understand things on a conceptual level. What's interesting is that we actually saw a number of concepts thus far, just to review the names of the concepts, to point out their relationship. We talked about Hidur Mitzvah, and that a mitzvah ought to be enhanced. And the idea that even though there are basic mitzvot that are given, we also have a directive of Zek Heli ve'anvehu. And we talk about how in the Daled Minim specifically, there's an aesthetic quality to them. And we talked about the nature of Hidur Mitzvah. We didn't get down to ground level to all the Piskei Din about how much you ought to spend in terms of how much you ought to spend extra on a mitzvah, that to be added to Mosif, Shlish, etc. We talked more about the characteristics of Hidur Mitzvah. That was one topic. Then we went into a topic which is a very complex topic because it is at the seam between an individual who wants to do the right thing exactly as they're doing the wrong thing and trying to reconcile those two. That was the topic of Mitzvah Baba Avera. And Mitzvah Baba Avera is complicated by the reality that instead of having a binary system, you're either in God's good graces or you're in the bad book. It's the good book or the bad book. It's so simple, so obvious. In Mitzvah Baba Avera, it's actually about the interplay between an individual who wants to do good on one level, they want to do a mitzvah, but it's through ill-gotten gains. The reality that no human being, because of the nature of humanity, is per se necessarily able to reach the zenith of consistency and perfection in terms of Shmirat Mitzvot. And everybody is some admixture at some level of mitzvot and non-mitzvot, right? I'm butchering the pasuk, but right, there's no such thing as that which is not a complicated composite. That's humanity. And yet, there is a point after which that conflict has just gone off the rails. You can no longer conscionably say, I'd like to serve Hashem with this object, which is I received and I acquired through some act of Aveira. And we were trying to almost like freeze frame the goings on of a person who stole an object, then wants to use the object for a mitzvah. At what point, freeze framing, did that object leave the control of the person who rightfully owns it? And when did it become the owner, under the control rather, of the individual who stole it? Do they acquire? We didn't even get into most of the ins and outs of it. You could spend many, many months on the subject of trying to parse at what level does the taint remain indelible, and when and how can we say on one ledger the person did the wrong thing and they're a sinner and they're full of chata'im, and on another ledger they also are doing a mitzvah. Like at what point does the object itself or the actions confluence one into the other, cause some kind of a collapse of the capacity for the mitzvah to be fulfilled? A mitzvah haba ba'avera. We parsed even what those words mean. Is it the mitzvah is coming through the act of avera? The mitzvah is coming as a result of the avera at exactly the same time. There were different opinions in the Rishonim, etc. And now we're up to a sugya. So I've covered now Hidur Mitzvah, Mitzvah Baba Avera, and now Baal Tosif is almost like the opposite of Hidur Mitzvah. Hidur Mitzvah says, here's some basic mitzvahs. Wouldn't you like to enhance them? Wouldn't you like to beautify them? Now you come to Baal Tosif. Baal Tosif, the mitzvah, whose flip side is Baal Tigra, is, wait a second, don't deviate from how the mitzvah goes, because after a point, you're not serving Hashem, you're actually changing, transforming the nature of the mitzvah to something you would like better, in which case it's no longer avodat Hashem, but some other kind of avodah. Some would even call it, again, just for the purpose of driving the point home, an avodah zara, like an eish zara. It's not that you're worshiping another god, it's that you're deciding how you want to do it. And it's no longer about what the mitzvah itself is. And it has to do, in the case of Baal Tosif, with adding something. And Baal Tigra would be its flip side, somehow taking away from something. Now the question is, what is this something? We've seen three different examples. One example is that you're trying to do something to change the system. You're trying to increase the number of mitzvot, or you're trying to claim that something that is really not actually from the Torah is from the Torah. You're adding to the mitzvot of the Torah, of which there are a finite number. And we know what that number is, let's say 613. The idea that we have a corpus of mitzvot. The truth is, even though there is a discrepancy, the Rambam does not have the same list exactly as the Ramban. The Ramban took the Rambam to task. It's true. But as the Rambam points out, there could be what's called Baal Tosif, what Rav Asher Weiss calls, we'll see that hopefully later tonight, Baal Tosif Behora. I'm adding, through the way that I'm teaching something about the Torah, to the Torah in a manner that perverts or distorts, is a better word, the actual Dine Torah, which are from the Torah, versus that which is D'Rabbanan. That's one level of Baal Tosif. Baal Tosif number 2, that I messed around with the object. 4 compartments of tefillin, I like 5 compartments. 4 strands of the tzitzit, I like 5 strands of the tzitzit. 4 species in the lulav, I want to add a 5th, or I want to take away one of these elements. That's something about the object of the mitzvah. As Rav Asher Weiss, we'll hopefully see it tonight, a very lucid presentation. He gives the example that we saw in the Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. What if the Kohen wants to add brachas? He was already up there. He said Yivarecha, he said Ya'er, he said Yisa. And then he remembers there's a pasuk from Parshat Devarim, which is so beautiful. Yosef Hashem aleichem kachem elef pamim vivarechetchem, right? But that's not acceptable. That's not adding to the teaching of the Torah, but it is adding to the object of the mitzvah. What's the object of mitzvah? Here, the object are the words. Yeah. There's a third possibility. So one, you're trying to change the system somehow to distort what's from the Torah and what's midrabanan. The classic example is you decide to start telling people of b'chalav is aser min Torah. Fowl and dairy mixed together is forbidden from the Torah. That's not correct. That's a midrabanan. And you have to keep things straight. We talked a little bit about that. That was in the Rambam specifically. The object, category 2, object of mitzvah. You're messing around with how many objects you're going to hold, or how many objects, so to speak, you're going to speak. We talked a little bit about, in that vein, what's going to happen with the shofar, where we know full well that even though the Torah tells us that all you have to do is you have to hear the sound of the trua 3 times, but the sound of the trua needs to be, as we learn, bracketed between a tekiah before, a tekiah after, and we know that we're not sure. The Gemara says what the sound of the trua is. Is it trua like we call it? Is it shvarim, or is it shvarim trua? So we do all the permutations. Well, that'll get you to 30 blasts, but then we do it before we start Musaf, and then in the middle of Musaf. And we, you and me, since the days of the Geonim, even go farther to get to 100 blasts. Well, is that Baal Tosif? We talked about that, and that's the third category, which is the action itself, repeating the action, whether it's repeating the action of the extra kiyot, whether it's repeating the action or messing somehow with the timeline. You don't like the fact that the mitzvah of Sukkot ended after 7 days. You live in Israel. You say the 8th day, I'm going to go in the Sukkah and I'm going to say I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of Sukkot now because I like it. Well, is that serving God? Is that serving yourself? Right? So that's another kind of Baal Tosif. That's about the action or the timing that has been somehow played with and distorted. So again, teaching is one level, the object of the mitzvah, or maybe the action of the mitzvah. 3 different possibilities and 3 different applications, really, of the concept of Baal Tosif. So I'm just lining up. These are like the main topics we've talked about now for months. Hidur mitzvah, and then again, there was a subtopic of Yavesh, etc., but it was bound up with Hidur. We talked about this mitzvah haba ba'avera, and now we're up to Baal Tosif. And really, to the extent that you happen to line up this way in the Gemara. It's just how it is, right? To the extent that Hidur mitzvah is about enhancing the mitzvah, beautifying. Who's going to beautify it? You beautify it. I beautify it. Spend extra money, look for something that looks nice. So I'm making a certain choice to enhance, and that is expansive. By the same token, on the other side of the ledger is, oh, wait a second, don't go too far. Don't decide I want to put 30 minim together and say to Hashem, look, I love Sukkot so much, and you control everything, not just you didn't just create 4 species. I want to raise up roses for you, God, a bouquet of roses. That's not allowed. That's so Batz Baal Tosif. But each of them in their own category. And what the Rishonim are trying to debate within each category is, okay, well, wait a second. We have examples of things that happen that are part of how we observe Judaism that don't seem to fit so neatly into the category. And the first category about teaching something, about learning something and not adding something from the Torah, and probably an amalgam of that. And the third category about time, about putting things in time, whether expanding time of a mitzvah or maybe even creating a mitzvah. We talked about Purim. The Ramban had mentioned Purim, that the Gemara says in Masechet Megillah and Daf Yud Daled that the Chachamim were really struggling out of 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses. They never added or subtracted any mitzvah except Mikra Megillah. What do we accept Mikra Megillah? So the Yerushalmi discusses in other places, the Yerushalmi in Megillah Davav, in other places, discusses the fact that they were breaking their heads, you could say. It's not a very eloquent way to say it, but that's what it means. They were sitting on this problem. How will we, should we, can we justify adding a holiday? The countervailing example is Yeravam ben Nevat creates a holiday, which Benny has pointed out in previous shiurim was an extension of Sukkot. That's true. But it was like a month later. It wasn't like the day after Sukkot. He said, let's just keep going. We love the holiday. He waited a month later and he made up a holiday. I think it was Judah, you had mentioned at the end of last year, what about Yom Ha'atzmaut? And I said, well, it's not really, it doesn't necessarily obtain that it's Baal Tosif per se. You asked about the Hallel, actually, in Yom Ha'atzmaut. So I said the Hallel might be actually under a different rubric, that generally when a nace happens, maybe you have to say Hallel to Hashem, and that might be in that category. But the issue of creating a new holiday, that might be in the category of Baal Tosif, depending on what you're going to pack into the holiday. Yeah. So that's an example, let's say, in the world of Horah, of teaching, and Purim is right at the forefront of that question. In the end, of course, the Chachamim have divine inspiration, essentially. They figure out that the pasuk in Parshat B'Shalach at the end, Ktov Zot Zikaron B'Sefer, is to give them a window into how there is some basis in the scripture, in the Torah, in the Tanakh, for the concept of there being a holiday against or celebrating the downfall of the enemies of the Jewish people at the time from the nation of Amalek, and that's the holiday that we call Purim. In the second category, objects, the question of objects of mitzvah, and we'll get into that a little bit more tonight. What does that actually mean? Art had mentioned the question of, there's a guy who he has his lulav, and on the top he took an elastic band and he wrapped it around because he likes it better. So an elastic band, a rubber band, is definitely not the material that you can say is one of the daled minim. It's also not roses. Everybody looks at it, they see a piece of aluminum foil or something, it's far, far away. On the other hand, it is still a min. It's some object that's getting into the bundle in some way. So is that something that destroys its integrity? And in the case of the masa mitzvah or the zman, or the repetition of mitzvahs, so that, as an example, is in fact sitting in the sukkah when it's no longer Sukkot. And you could say even in Chutz La'aretz, who said you can add a day? So we understand, okay, well, they're not sure it's either this way or it's that way. Right. In other words, the 7th day of Sukkot is really the 7th day, or it's the 6th day. The first day is either day 0 or it's day 1. Day 2 is day 2 or it's day 1, right? And so on and so forth. So day 8 is either day 8 or it's day 7. That's why we sit in the sukkah in Chutz La'aretz. How come nobody said, wait a second, Baal Tosif? I would have thought that's a pretty important consideration. Yet it doesn't seem to figure in. Another example, back to shofar. I want to blow the shofar sitting, and blow the shofar standing, and I blow the shofar at the end of shul, and I blow it here, going to blow it there. Well, there's a limit. The Torah didn't say blow as many as you like. It said trua appears 3 times. The Gemara learns blow the trua 3 times. And we have a limud, tekiah before, tekiah after, and we don't have the combination. So we're sort of playing it out. It might be this, it might be that. But what's going on here? Yeah. So all of this, I hope this is a comprehensive enough review. Started at 30,000 feet and I came down a little bit. We have 3 categories of types of Baal Tosif, and in each one we're seeing different different approaches from various among the Rishonim. What we had spoken about last time was we had seen the approach of the Rashba, and then the attack or the approach of the Pnei Yehoshua. I don't want to review the whole thing, but we need it in order to get to the next step, which is the Shiltei Giborim that I want to show you tonight. And from there, we'll move to some other ideas. If there's time, I also want to see the Gemara in Sanhedrin on this subject. So bear with me. Okay, let me pause here. Questions, comments before I go on? Unmute yourself if you want to speak. Otherwise, we go. Okay? Okay, so let's go. All right, so now, last we had learned, we had seen the position of the Rashba. And again, you can ask yourself each time, well, which category is this? Is this Hora'ah, teaching something about the system? Is it about the object, or is it about the performance of the mitzvah, the Masa mitzvah, or the Zman of the mitzvah? Certainly, shofar is not about the object, it's about the performance factor. And the Baalei Tosfot had basically stated previously that they think that when we're talking about the repeat of a mitzvah, that's never Baal Tosif. That's quoted by the Rashba here. It was the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, page 16a to 16b. And Baalei Tosfot had said it's not going to be considered Baal Tosif if you repeat a mitzvah. If you took a lulav several times, you ate matzah several times, that's not Baal Tosif, right? He gave the example about putting the blood on the mizbeach several times. None of that's going to be Baal Tosif. And so too, if you blow the shofar and then you return again, you blow the shofar, that's not Baal Tosif, right? That's really not going to be. Even if you're going to do, say it's for the sake of the mitzvah, it's fine, right? And the Rashba says he doesn't like this idea. He says it doesn't really make sense to him. He says, basically, I can't accept that this is really what's going on. Instead, he has another idea. What's his idea? He says that anything that the Chachamim got up and thought was necessary is automatically not Baal Tosif. You know why? Because they have a sweeping power. What's that sweeping power? In the 17th chapter of Sefer Dvarim, it says, Al Pi Torah Asher Yorucha, according to the Torah, they will instruct you. Any Torah, anything they make up, anything that's important that they say you can do, you can do. And here's an example. So here's an example. On this 8th day of Sukkot, nowadays, we sit, he writes, we sleep and we eat in the sukkah as a form of mitzvah, even though we know 100%. The Rashba, living such as he is outside of Israel, he's in Seville, so he does this like we do it in Chutz La'aretz. He's in his sukkah on Shmini Atzeret. Isn't that Baal Tosif? No, Rabbi Yochanan says, yeah, well, it's just in case that we're doing it. We know that's true. However, if it was for the sake of Beit Din, there goes there. Sorry, they have permission. Kol Utzarach Beit Din goes to Masifim Rosh Hashanah. They have permission, and that's true with Baal Tigra. They can take things away as well. What's his prime example? On Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbos, don't blow shofar. He could just say, they could just say that. You know why? Because they're the Chachamim. They make it up, and it's totally fine. Okay, it's totally fine. I just saw the notes now to please make it larger. So I'm doing that. I'm sorry. And Art, I'll get back to your point with the rubber band. I hope we get back to the later tonight. I'm already past it. So I'm sorry I missed it before, but let's keep going. But the Rashba basically says sweeping powers that the Chachamim have. That's what's at stake. And therefore, if the Chachamim decided that they want to enact something about blowing the shofar many, many times, then they could just do it. It's not Baal Tosif. And it's not related. That's what he's saying over here. It's not because you can do the mitzvah over and over and over again. Because the Chachamim themselves said you're allowed to blow the shofar seated, means before Shemona Esrei, and then you can blow the shofar when you're in the middle of the Amidah. You're mixing up the Satan, permissible, allowed, no problem, because the Chachamim said so. That's the dividing line. The Pnei Yehoshua, next source, next slide, took the Rashba to task. Right? He didn't really like what the Rashba had to say. He says, I see that the Rashba asks a question against Tosfot. I see that he answers it, but he says to me, I think this is forced to be able to say this, that the Chachamim going to make up anything they want. They just decide it. He says, no, I think actually Baal Tosif The hachmil l'shayel bal tosif takana chachamim hainu davke b'may shetiknu chachamim misum geder kegon dvarim hamishtanim lefi hazman lefi kilkul ador. I think that the power given to the chachamim to make enactments is in order to create a fence around the Torah for protective purposes, or if something has changed in the world, some historical exigency, you could say, and because of the fact that the generations are becoming more corrupted over time, so the Chachamim got the power to create new holidays if need be, such as Purim and Chanukah. That's the two words here, Megillah and Chanukah. Shnishtaneh davar shetiknu machmar ishtanu ta'inyan la'achar Matan Torah. Something changed in the world after Matan Torah. The days of Megillah, the whole Jewish people, everything hung in the balance. We were saved, right? Kimu v'kiblu, all of those Gemaras. Chanukah, the arrival of Greece. No more the straw man, enemy of the Jewish people who does not have seichel, is strictly idolatrous and pagan. Not that the Greeks were not, but they also had a lot of wisdom that they brought to bear, a chachma. And therefore they made a holiday to stand against it. They could do that, right? So that's not what's going on in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah when Rabbi Yitzchak says, "Oh, we're blowing a shofar many, many times to mix up the Satan." That's not a historical exigency. That's not protecting the system. That was true at Matan Torah. There was already a problem with the Satan, getting the people needing to be thrown off balance lest he engage in prosecution against the Jewish people. It was always true. It was true during Matan Torah. Mishum hachi, iyava ashkan be'oraita she'en litko ala pam achat, shapir havashayah b'hu bal tosif. If the Torah had said you're only allowed to blow shofar once, if it had said it one time, then that's true. Then it would have been bal tosif. That's true. If you had added, you would have been able to say, and therefore the Chachamim gave another answer, which is that Baal Tosif, the Chachamim meaning the Balei Tosfot said, Baal Tosif does not apply in the repetition of the same mitzvah over and over and over again. From the fact that the Torah told us we should blow multiple times, it meant that there's no upper limit. That's true. There's no upper limit. You want to keep blowing the shofar? Fine. But what the Pnei Yeshua did was to, as it were, defend the Balei Tosfot against the Rashba, and to say, Rashba, you're making a lot of good sense if there's a good historical reason that warrants the action of the Chachamim to make a takana, to fix something, to correct something, to protect something, to amend something based on historical circumstances, but not with regard to blowing shofar. The Satan is metaphysical. I explained it last year, maybe psychological, whatever it is, it existed the same at Matan Torah as it does today. So you can't argue something changed. Yeah. So that was the Pnei Yeshua. That's what we got up to last time. Enter the Shiltei Giborim. The next page. I'm sorry to make everyone so dizzy. The Shiltei Giborim is on the run. Lived in the 16th century, almost certainly from Megurashei Sfarad.
Rabbi?
Yeah. Larry, go ahead.
Before you go on, how does Shmini Atzeret in the Sukka fit within those two standards of Geder or historical event?
The Rashba says that it is actually an example of where the Chaim have the power to do that. And if they decide to legislate it, the reason for it, just so you realize, has to do with the possibility, far-fetched today though it may be, that they realized that there might be something wrong with the arrival of the emissaries to the far communities. Therefore, they institutionalized Sfeika Diyoma, not because they didn't know. I mean, this is like, if I had like my top 10 list of things that I've had arguments with people about in our own shul, and many shuls like it, it's nothing bad about our shul, chas v'shalom, is the misunderstanding that the words Sfeika Diyoma actually mean that the Chachamim were unsure which day is Yontif. It's not true. The Gemara itself says that the Chachamim knew exactly how to make the calendar work. It wasn't for that reason. They institutionalized deliberately a distinction between the people who live in Israel, people who live outside of Israel. It was not because of an actual literal suffix. The Gemara says this. Gemara in Beitza Daf Daled. It appears in various places. Daf Daled and Bet. The point of it is that they institutionalized it. It just happens to be called by the nomenclature of Sfeika Diyoma. It was based on the time when there once was a Sfeika Diyoma.
So why is he limiting it to two categories? Why doesn't he just say it can be anything Rabbanan wanted it to be.
That's what the Rashba does say. The Pnei Yehoshua says, Rashba, you're giving the Chachamim too much power. They never exercised that power other than for the following purposes: as a geder, protective, as because of some kind of change in the historical circumstance. The example of institutionalizing the 8th day of Sukkot, aka Shmini Atzeret, as a day that in Chutz La'aretz you should sit in the sukkah, is an example of something protective.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's the idea. Okay.
In the case of blowing shofar, I don't recall anywhere in the Torah it says how many blasts you have to give. So it just says Yom Teruah, whatever. So this gives the Chachamim the leeway to devise the number based upon some logical basis.
Yes.
And therefore, we cannot talk about adding to the mitzvah. That is the mitzvah. That whatever the indefinite number was.
Okay. I could hear that. The Torah uses the expression Yom Teruah, Zichron Teruah. I'm blanking on the third one. I think it might say Yom Teruah twice. Benny, help me out. Art, help me out. Francie, anybody?
No, in Emor it just says Yom Zichron Trua.
Yeah, that's Zichron Teruah.
Zichron Teruah, it says,
The Yom
That's it.
Teruah is in Parshat Pinchas.
Yes.
And then there's a third reference that is at the beginning of Parshat Bahar, if I'm not mistaken.
That's in connection with the Yovel, isn't
Yes,
it?
but yes.
Yeah.
But it's a hekesh in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah
okay.
that all of these are the three references to Trua.
To Trua.
That references the three Truas we need to hear.
It doesn't tell us how many, in what places, wherever.
Agreed.
Leaves it up to the Chachamim to decide in that regard.
True, but the we maintain that the mitzvah d'oraita, and we'll get back into this if we have time tonight still, that the mitzvah d'oraita is really a mitzvah to hear it 3 times, to hear the Trua 3 times.
Because of the 3 references in the Torah?
Yes, because of the Trua references, correct. Which are considered to be 3, even though, yes, I think in Parshat Bahar, it says Vavir Shofar B'chol Etzechem. I don't know if it uses the word Trua.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a blank then.
The pasuk about Ta'aviru Trua is about Yom HaKippurim. Yom HaKippurim Ta'aviru Trua B'chol Artzechem.
Trua or Shofar?
It's about Yovel on Yom Kippurim. That's not.
Yeah, yes. The Yovel on Yom HaKippurim.
But does it use the word Trua?
I don't think so. I don't
think so either. It's not my recollection.
I don't think it does say
No.
Trua.
No. Yeah, it actually does. Pasuk Tet. Ve'avarta shofar trua. Oh, George Lennon, you're on the call also. No, I'm calling my Bali Kriya. Everybody's here. I just only see a few people on the screen at one time. Ve'avarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi'i be'asur l'chodesh b'kippurim taviu shofar b'chol ha'etzechem. That's the third reference to the word trua in the Torah. There's a limud these 3 are there to tell us you have to hear it 3 times on the festival of Rosh Hashanah generally, believe it or not. Okay, I'm just saying that's what we got. Okay, now, okay. Hold on. Where are we? Yeah. Okay. So here's the Shiltei Giborim. I thought I was sharing the screen. I was showing it to you, but I guess I wasn't. Would be better, yeah? Here's a Shiltei Giborim. The Shiltei Giborim is just on the margin. It's really the middle of a whole long piece, but okay. Okay, it just points out v'chein asur l'nashim l'haniach tefillin afilu b'lo bracha mipnei shenira k'derech achitzonim she'ovrim al divrei chachamim ve'enem rotzim lidrosh hamikraot kimotan. the women are prohibited, according to Shiltei Giborim, from putting on tefillin, even without a bracha, because it looks like the people on the outside, the chitzonim, is a polite way of saying basically the sectarians who violate the words of the chachamim, and they don't want to explain the psukim in the Torah appropriately. Let's say it that way. There's more to it here, but I don't want to go into the whole thing. The Shiltei Giborim, it dovetails with the sheet at Rashi and Rosh Hashanah Lamed Gimel. Okay. You're not really going to be over on Baal Tosif until you say to yourself, I am now adding to the mitzvah. Ulafichach. Therefore, anu yoshim b'sukkah b'yom chet. We can sing the sukkah on the 8th day. V'chein tokim b'shofar b'yom sheni Rosh Hashanah. Remember, Rosh Hashanah is really only one day, according to the Torah. We all keep 2 days, even people in Israel. V'ochlim matzah v'lo sheni shel Pesach. U'mevarchim aleh al achilat matzah. Ava pi sheyesh lomar shema cholhu. V'aru mosif al mitzvah. Aren't you adding to the mitzvah in all those cases? That's not Baal Tosif. You know why? Kevan she'eino vitkavein lohosif, she'ein osim kein elo mishum safek, einam ovri mishul Baal Tosif. If you're doing a mitzvah repeatedly because you're not sure how to fulfill the mitzvah, is it this day? Is it that day? Is it this way? Is it that way? That's not Baal Tosif. Baal Tosif means you have in mind. What's Baal Tosif? You have to say, I consciously want to go add to the mitzvahs. For the Shiltei Giborim, he's fused the action that's repeated with the idea the action repeated has in mind category 1, I mentioned at the beginning of this year, where you're trying to change and distort the Torah itself, but not when you're not sure how to do the mitzvah, not when there's a suffix about it. Now, it could be what's called, I mentioned it before, an institutionalized suffix. There really is no suffix about sfeika de yoma. So the sages didn't know, but they institutionalized, we're going to keep it this way on purpose from the time when it was a suffix, lest it one day become a suffix again, a whole discussion of the Gemara there. That's true. By the way, I sort of showed my hand a little earlier, right? How can we blow so many shofar blasts? I mean, never mind 100. 30. Why is it 30? Well, it's true this way, or it's true this way, or it's true that way, and each one has to have a key on either side, you get up to 30. Wasn't that Baal Tosif? No, because you don't know what you're doing. You're not sure. So you're not over in Baal Tosif. Says the Shiltei Giborim about specifically about blowing shofar. V'chin amar b'tkiyot eino ela kemarbe. If you add to the tkiyat shofar, you know what that is? Wow, it's way too big now. It's like you're adding to prayer. You're adding tefillah, because the blowing of the shofar is an object of tefillah. When you're shaking this lulav around this way and that, you're like a lightsaber, that's not Baal Tosif. That's Hiddur Mitzvah, because it's part of the action of doing the mitzvah. And very beautifully for the Shiltei Giborim, the issue is, what is your intention when you're doing this repetitive action? Is your intention to distort the system? Or is it really a lack of understanding of whether or not what you're doing is actually fulfilling the mitzvah properly? Since you don't know, so you're trying your best to fulfill the mitzvah. And for the Shiltei Giborim, there's a fusion between category 1 and category 3. The action that you're doing, is it bound up with the desire to undermine something? Or not really? I'm just trying to get through the mitzvah. I'm trying to understand how to do the mitzvah in the best possible way. So I got to try this combination, that combination, and particularly shofar is an act of tefillah in and of itself. And as an act of tefillah, it is in and of itself not going to be considered a violation of Baal Tosif, no matter how many times you blow the shofar. Regarding the Rashba's example, the Chachamim can do anything they want. Would no lulav on Shabbat be just a good example of no shofar on Shabbat? Is there a good reason why the Rashba chose the latter rather than the former? I think it's just the Rashba. Art just asked that question. If you look in the chat, the answer, I believe, is that he was writing in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. So the easiest thing to reach for was no shofar on Shabbat. But I think no lulav on Shabbat would be the same thing. It's the same Gzera D'Rabba, I believe. It's actually not the same Gzera D'Rabba, by the way. But it's we'll say for tonight it is. And it's not really because a a lulav, every single person takes it in their hand, and shofar, you can start making a case that it's only one person in the shul, but there may be historically the possibility that everyone blew shofar back in the day, and that's why there's a machloket about whether the bracha is litkoa or lishmoa. It's not clear. Anyway, there are a bunch of hands up. I'm sorry, George, you've been waiting so patiently. Forgive me. Slicha mechila, go. You're still muted. Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
So did this all stop when the Sanhedrin stopped?
Did what
as far
stop?
as the Balto, you said that only the Chachamim were allowed to do it.
Right.
Right. So after that, it's what's remarkable to me is for thousands of years we were able to really hold this up until really, I guess, the Reform conservative movement came into being and things started to change. But that what's my question is how did we do this for so many years? Hold on to this, and who decide when did it, about what time? What was the time period when the Chachamim stopped?
Well, as long as it was Sanhedrin Agadol, this could continue, right?
So anything in the Middle Ages that you could think of where there was
too late. Middle Ages, too late.
But would anybody come up or any historical thing where there was something that happened and there's a big discussion that it's about Tosif? Nothing. The conservative, really, it's not about Tosif, it's the opposite, where they kind of peeled back and started.
I don't think I want to go into anything that sounds polemical right now. I'm gonna stick with the Gemara.
I'm not.
I'll frame it. Yeah, I have a lot to say, but I'm getting schar just to.
Right.
Chuck points out about Rabbeinu Gershom.
Yeah. Okay, it's a good.
Okay. Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagola did make certain takanot which apply to the Bnei Ashkenaz. You could point to kitniot would be an example. Larry, give me a minute. Kitniot is an example. There are things that happen, but they're all, what they have in common is they're all restrictive. They're all extensions on either concretizing and formalizing is the word I was looking for, something that already was the status quo, or protecting something that already exists. Chachamim can make takanot. They do that. That has happened. But the specter of Baal Tosif would come up if someone tried to enact something new out of whole cloth, and to give it a certain ma'amad that it ought not have in terms of legislating something to change something, falsify something about the Torah. Here, again, I don't want to go too far into polemics. There's a lot to say about it, and I don't want to step in the wrong on like a landmine over here. But yes, some of the basic assumptions about how Torah functions, what the rules are about who can just get up and decide, oh, we're just going to make some changes, is at the heart of the issues of the advent of the reform movement and the conservative movement, et cetera. Ad hayom hazeh, just there's no point in fighting anymore because everyone is, in large measure, just so divergent. The basic assumptions, the basic principles of argumentation, the basic axioms about the universe are not shared anymore. They're just not. And one of them does turn on this, is about the question of Baal Tosif and the I would say the sanction that Chachamim have to make changes to the system, enactments within the system, and what that might augur. That's a partial answer, and there's more to say. Larry, you were waiting patiently. I'm sorry.
He's muted.
My hand is down.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's go back now to, and this maybe is a follow-up to what George was asking about, but we'll see it inside because this is part of sort of the discussion. It's the next phase. We're going back to the Rambam now to see the Raavad next to the Rambam and to try to understand a little bit more about what their Nikurat HaMachloket is. So here's the Rambam again. We learned this Rambam already. We should be old hands at it. It's weeks ago, but it's the first category. What Rav Asher Weiss calls Baal Tosif in terms of Hora'ah. That's something about the way you're teaching things is itself a distortion. claiming things are min haTorah when really they're midirabanan, falsifying the Torah in that way. So he had mentioned that they have the power to make zerot, to forbid that which is permitted, and to keep it for all generations. Also to be matir isurei Torah lefi shaz as a hora'at sha'ah, and this is what the Torah is warning about when it said don't add and don't take away. Don't add to pieces of the Torah. Don't detract from them. Don't put anything in for good that is really b'shabichtav or claim it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, where you're inventing stuff. And the example is lo tavasha gdiba chalev yimo, and he fills it out. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. And we learn you can't cook, you can't eat, right? And this is regardless whether it's behema, bus, or chaya. But if you come along and you claim that it's true for fowl, that's a distortion. Now, why did the Rambam choose this example of all things? Because the reason why it's a bit of a strange example is it's an example where the person who's doing the distortion is actually elevating something to the level of a Torah mitzvah. That's better, isn't it? You're making it more machmir and stronger. The Rambam says that's the isser. You're not allowed to do that. Rabbi Michael Rosenzweig, when we studied the sugya, he pointed out that the best first example of this happened already in the Garden of Eden. It is exactly what happened when the Nachash and Chava are having some kind of conversation, and Chava, Aim Kol Chai, mentions that we're not allowed to touch the tree. And then Rashi points out that the Nachash pushed Chava into the tree. She touched it, and she realized I could touch it and nothing bad's going to happen. The fact that they pushed it too far, even though there was no such isser to touch it, actually was, you could say, kolomosif goreya. By adding, they had actually detracted. It's interesting, the Rambam here says that what you would think is ratcheting up the protection of the Torah is actually undermining the Torah, because it is a falsification as well. And he gives that as the example, and he sort of fills it out as you go. And then he gives you other examples where you could have also had a distorted interpretation. And George, back to your question, where you could have said, why did it say don't cook a kid in its mother's milk? I'm not saying what the Rambam says. I'm giving you a good, because it's cruelty to animals. It's cruel. It's not, so therefore it's cruelty to animals if in the mother's milk you're cooking her own child. But if it's another mother, that's not really the prohibition. Okay, that's distorting the Torah. The Rambam writes this, but obviously it didn't go with the advent of certain movements that went off the reservation in terms of the basic axioms of the halachic system. That is an example of how it functioned. They took the mitzvot and homileticized them into oblivion. They don't really apply. When it says don't eat milk and meat, it doesn't literally mean that. It means learn good lessons about ethics and values, etc. But it doesn't actually literally mean don't eat basar b'chalav together. It doesn't actually mean that. Okay, that's a distortion of Torah. And for the Rambam, that's in the category of Baal Tosif, which is about the here where you're adding or subtracting something in Torah Shebirtav, something in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yeah. Now comes along the Raavad in his sharp-tongued way. The Raavad was described variously as Chachmato Martichato. His anger boiled within him. He had a very sharp tongue. Sometimes he lashed out at the Rambam. Here's a little bit of an example. He writes, Amar Avram, Kol Eile Yisa Ruach. All of this should be carried by the wind. Shekol davar shegazru alav ve'asru l'siag u'lemishmeret shel Torah ein bo mishum mosif. Anything, because the truth is anything that the Chachamim made a gzeira about and that they forbid as a guardian in order to guard the Torah, protect the Torah, that's not Baal Tosif, automatically, regardless of what it is. Afilu kav'u l'dorot v'as'u kishel Torah v'samchu l'mikra. Even if they said it's just like a Dvar Torah, even if they said that it is on the level of Torah, even if they attached it to a pasuk, as we find in several places, midrabanan ukra asmachta ba'alma, and then it says, and the pasuk is an asmachta. We find this in several places where the Chachamim come up with something to say in the kra, the pasuk is an asmachta. Asmachta here, I don't know how to translate it according to the Raavad, because we'll see in a moment according to Rav Asher Weiss, what the Raavad means here is not the way we normally understand asmachta ba'alma as it's just a mnemonic device, but rather it's actually anchored in the Torah. It is now the official understanding of this mitzvah, sourced in the Torah, on a Torah level. And that's not what the Rambam wants to say. The Raavad is ratcheting it up. V'imgara lefitzara shah. But if you want to detract, you could do that temporarily. He seems to agree with the Rambam here. Kigon Eliyahu Bar Carmel. He's allowed to do that. But avzeh davar Torahu, eit lasot lashem efir tortecha. But the fact that he did that, it's not bal tigra, it's not detracting from the Torah because he didn't institutionalize it, but also it was a Torah level enactment that he enacted. Because the scripture tells us that when it's a time to do for God, sometimes you have to abrogate parts of the Torah. So says the pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. Lo timtza iser mosif ela b'mitzvot aseh. When is Baal Tosif operative? The Raavad says to the Rambam, never when it has to do with teachings by the Chachamim, but always when it has to do with positive mitzvahs that have objects. Kigon lulav utfilin v'tzitzit. Uchiyotze behen, and such as those, right? Bein l'sha, bein l'dorot, bein shekava b'dvar Torah, bein shelo kav'ah. In all those circumstances, says the Raavad, that's Baal Tosif. So unlike the Rambam, who thought that Baal Tosif is about making claims about how you will teach that something is from the Torah or is midrabanan, your understanding of it could itself be Baal Tosif, Baal Tigra. For the Raavad, no. Anything the Chachamim say, that's going to be a Dvar Torah automatically. That's permitted. But it's kind of like the Rashba, that the Chachamim have this power. They can do whatever they want. And whatever they'll say, that is Dvar Torah. But what is Baal Tosif? The Raavad has to answer for what actually is Baal Tosif. Objects. For the Raavad, he doesn't recognize Baal Tosif in the world of category 1. What would he call that which, errant, deviant sages are doing against the Torah? I'm not sure. I don't think he could call it Baal Tosif. He's saying right here, Baal Tosif is only with regard to the fulfillment of positive mitzvahs. That's what he says down here. Yeah. So that's the Raavad. Now, to understand the Raavad a little bit better, journey with me to Rav Asher Weiss. If we spend another 15 minutes or so together, if I'm successful, just to read and explain what the Rav Asher Weiss is saying, we have a whole new world into understanding what goes on throughout Shas. Whenever it says asmachta, right? Asmachta ba'alma, asmachta lismoch, to lean on something that's reliant upon. It's merely something that's reliant upon. That's what the words literally mean. But we'll understand a little bit more in depth now.
Doesn't it come from the word?
Sorry, go ahead.
Doesn't it come from the word someach, to rely on?
Yeah, lismoch, to lean, to lay on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
V'hinei arrived chilek sham al divrei Rambam v'tamal dvarav mimad matzina b'har b'mekomot b'shas b'isur derabanan da'asmechu akra. We see that the argument is the Raavad said to the Rambam. Well, there are many times in Shas that it is an isur derabanan, and then it says there's an asmachta, and it's attached to a pasuk. They relied upon the words of the Torah. Harambam lichora avra bal tosif ela al korchach kol shetiknu chachamim mishum siag umismeret ein bo mishum bal tosif av shamer demin hatorahu. So according to the Rambam, says the Raavad, the Rambam thinks that every time the Chachamim made any kind of an enactment and they said it's attached to a pasuk, that's Baal Tosif? No. The Raavad says, actually, anytime the Chachamim made any kind of a siag, offense, anything that did something to protect the system, that's never Baal Tosif. And whatever the Chachamim said, this is the Chidush of the Raavad, is actually Min HaTorah. So now let's understand what he's saying here.
And it doesn't seem. Does the Rambam really mean what Rav Asher Weiss is saying here? He meant. The Rambam is saying you can't say something is deoraita if it's not deoraita. But right. The Rabbanan are not saying that. They're saying we're giving a new gezerah de Rabbanan, but we're giving you a pasuk that has a remez to it. I don't think that doesn't seem to fall within what the Rambam is claiming is a problem.
No, this is what Rav Asher Weiss is claiming the Raavad understood in the Rambam. Not what Rav Asher Weiss thinks the Rambam is saying, as we'll see momentarily.
Okay, but Okay, if the Raavad is understanding the Rambam that way, it seems like a strange way of understanding the Rambam. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, if you read the Rambam, there's nothing in the Rambam that seems to be saying that. He's saying you can't actually claim something is deoraita, but to say there's a pasuk that gives a remez to it, it doesn't seem to be doing the same thing.
Right. I'm with you, but that's the Ravid's attack on the Rambam, says Rav Asher Weiss, is the Raavad says to the Rambam, how could you claim that the use of asmachta ba'alma is an issue of Baal Tosif when we all know that anything the Chachamim say that they attach to the words of the Torah is itself now deoraita?
Yeah.
And that just seems, what? So let's look at inside. Lichora hava amina desfarla Rambam kishida ritva b'rosh Hashanah tetvav the smachta heve ke'ein din Torah. It seems, Havamina, he's not going to accept this, that the Rambam holds, according to the Raavad, the Rambam holds just like the Ritva. What does the Ritva hold? That when it says asmachta, as opposed to the Chachamim say X, Y, Z, when it says the Chachamim say X, and it's attached and attributed and ascribed to and anchored in this pasuk, what they mean in that latter situation is it's a din Torah. And it's not like a regular Issa D'Rabbanan. El zeh be'emet kavanat Torah. V'nim sar davar l'chachamim lefaresh inyan haktuvim b'kavanatam. In other words, whenever it says in the Torah something in the pasuk, and the Chachamim are saying that's an asmachta to what we say, it's really that the Chachamim are merely unpacking something that in and of itself is sourced in the Torah and is actually itself at its core deoraita. V'aritva katav sham. The Mishim Farish gather a smach to being an acher, kilu isid rabbanan ba'almahu, uvofen malachuti asmechu akra, harezet dat minut. Now let me tell you what the Ritva just said, if you didn't catch it. According to the Ritva, by the way, I'm in big trouble. A lot of us might be in big trouble. The Ritva holds that when you see a thing in the Gemara, that there's a limud in the Gemara, where the Chachamim say something, a din d'Rabbanan, and then it says in the Gemara, and there's an asmachta to the following pasuk, it's attached, anchored in this pasuk, you think that's just a mnemonic device? You're a heretic. It's not a mnemonic device. If you think that it's really ki'ilu, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan, ba'alma, it's merely an Issa D'Rabbanan, and it's only for often malachuti, you'd say it's the Rav Asher Weiss's language, but it's as a matter of professionalism, a matter of form. They decided as a mnemonic device to attach to a pasuk. That is heretical. That's the Ritva's view. Luckily for us, Rav Asher Weiss points out, Nira lichora dat haram kshita Ritva. Sounds like, at least however the Raavad understood it, that the Rambam understands it like the Ritva. Ufizeh Lokash l'didei kushat Raavad. That there's no question on the part of the Raavad. Debemet ein asmachta isid Rabbanan. Ella, what's an asmachta really? It's kavanat haTorah. It's teaching us the meaning of what the Torah really wanted to say. Umishum kach ein b'zeh iser de Baal Tosif. But the Rav Asher Weiss says, wait a second. Ach be'emet ein zeh nachon. This is not correct. The Rabbim haRishonim hacholkim al Ritva. Many Rishonim disagree with the Ritva's characterization. B'zeh. Uv'tocham gam Rambam, and the Rambam himself disagrees with the Ritva. Ulashitatam, according to the other opinion, the heretical opinion, according to the Ritva, have a asmachta kechol isir derabanan. Asmachta is like all other isir derabanan. V'lo k'mitzvah Torah. It's not on the level of a Torah mitzvah. Shari katav Rambam behakdam l'perish Mishnah Lizraim. He wrote it himself. Right, B'dibur hamatchil. Uvechasher meit Yehoshua b'vo'ol levaer gather asmachta in the paragraph beginning, and when Yehoshua died, he wanted to explain what is an asmachta. The Rambam himself wrote, "Aval nismecha zot hamitzvah lezeh pasuk lesiman," a mnemonic device. Kedei she'ehei noda v'nizkar, it should be known and remembered. Ve'eno me'inyan hakatuv. It's not really what's actually written in the text. It's an anchor so that when you're learning, you come across it. Oh, it reminds me of this din d'Rabban. And that's why, says the Rambam, every time it says in the Gemara, right, kra, the pasuk, is an asmachta b'alma, it is merely an asmachta. That's why it's merely an asmachta, because it's merely a mnemonic device. V'ayin b'maharil, no likutim, the Maharil from Yehudei Ashkenaz from the 14th century, extremely important for the Minig Ashkenaz. The Maharil in the Likutim writes in Ot Ein, Shekadavi said, quote, Kol heichad yitmer midarabanan hu ukra asmachta ba'alma, whenever it says in the Gemara that this is midarabanan, but the pasuk is an asmachta, hache pirusho, this is what it means. Vadai takanta derabananu. It is, of course, completely a rabbinic enactment. Vehem yatsu ubadku. They went out to search, to check, umatzlim smach mikra. They found some place to hang their teaching somewhere on a pasuk. V'samchu divrei alav. Why did they do this? Now here's another idea. Kedei lahachzikam, in order to strengthen the point that they were making, which itself is no more than a rabbinic point. Sheyu svurim dehumi deoraita v'yachmiru bo, so that people will be of the opinion that really it is mideoraita, and they'll be more machmir with regard to it. V'lo ati l'zalzil lahaka b'divrei chachamim, and they won't come to denigrate the words of the sages. And here in the Machon Yerushalayim edition, Rav Weiss says, the annotated edition, it even adds the words Kedei lahatotam. They won't do anything to mess, to mix them up. V'kach nira gam dara Tosif b'menachot tzadi bet amud bet shekatvu kra asmachta ba'alma leukme girsa l'simana. What does that mean, leukme girsa l'simana? To establish a version as a mnemonic device. Hareilan gimel rabotenu. I have three sources now: Rambam, Maharil, Tosfot. Meirotenu rishonim shenaktu de be'emet heve asmachta kechol derabanan. It's like any other din derabanan. V'chol echad mehem mitnabei b'signono ma'inyan matzu chacham lahasmich divrei akra. They each have their own reason why they mention that, how they explain it. Right? For the Rambam and Tosfot, it's along the same lines. It's some kind of a mnemonic device. For the Maharil, it's so that people will take things more seriously because it's actually anchored somewhere in the text. L'Rambam Kedei Sheyehei Noda v'Nizkar, should be known and recalled. V'afsha Rambam Ma'iri Sham Halach L'Moshe Misinai Sheismichu Akra Nira Barur D'Zedaito Gam B'Derabanan. And even with regard to Halach L'Moshe Misinai, if it has also an asmachta, that's not really an asmachta. It's the same thing. He holds that asmachta part is only to be the Rabbanan. Sheismichu Akra. That's what it means. It's merely an asmachta. L'Maharil kedei sheyachmiru ba to shel Torah, so that people will be machmir with it like it's a dvar Torah, a level of Torah. And for Tosfot, for a siman and a girsa, which to me sounds almost like the same thing as kedei sheyeh noda v'nizkar. By the way, noda v'nizkar, you could say, is when you're laning in Shabbos morning, as you go through it, you find that pasuk, it reminds me of a din derabanan. This one, Latosos Simun Lagirsa, might be when you're learning with the thumb, you're trying to remind yourself, so the mnemonic device is in the learning itself. It could be that's a distinction. I'm not sure. So Rav Asher Weiss, what has he basically said on this page? For those who may have fallen asleep or lost the flow, he said the Raavid's attack on the Rambam was to try to claim that for the Rambam, there was some way of, he read into the Rambam, the Raavad read into the Rambam, that in fact it's Baal Tosif if the Chachamim make something new and they attach it to a pasuk. The fact is that the Chachamim can write and say whatever they want, and it's automatically a din Torah. He was like protesting against the Rambam. But as the Rav Asher Weiss points out, really the Rambam does not hold like the Ritva holds, and does not hold like the way that the Raavad wanted to impute to him that he holds, that somehow when it says cross smachta ba'alma, that's a din Torah. Au contraire, says Rav Asher Weiss, I show you three sources where actually you could see that Rishonim disagree with that idea, and they think that asmachta really means it's the Rabbanan, and it has some attachment to a pasuk. George, can you give me another minute? Okay. According to Tosfot's approach, there's no question here on the question of the Raavad. The kaven dechol in asmach to have a legirs l'simana lo amru klal to have been a Torah. The aim is a Baal Tosif. There's no discussion about Baal Tosif when we speak about attaching something to a pasuk. The Raavad is claiming, that there's something going on here. It could be Baal Tosif. It's not Baal Tosif at all. It's only legirs l'simana ve'efshar da'af l'shita Rambam lo amru to have a mina Torah. Ela asmchu akra kidei sheyeh nodav v'niskar. Agav, here it is. Agav kriyat Torah, v'alimud b'Torah shebichtav. When you're learning Torah shebichtav, or you're laning, you'll read those words. It'll remind you of what went on when you were learning in the Beis Medrash about this limud of Chazal. V'nir shaf l'shita d'Maharil. Yesh lomar de'ein b'zeh bal Tosif, delo b'vadai gilu gedolei Chazal mitaknei takana l'talmidehem de'ein eile isurei Torah ela asmachta. Ela shlo gilu zot b'shar bat rabim kedei shahamonei ha'am yechashvu shedashu zot mikra. I mean, this is unbelievable. Rav Asher Weiss says that the Maharil's reasoning that it's to strengthen the words of Chachamim is that, of course, he says the rabbis told their students in the advanced shir, this is really only the Rabbanan. But that was not announced publicly. For public consumption, they wanted people to think, and this is really radical, that actually what's written in the Pasuk, that the Chachamim had a takana, the Rabbanan, that really itself is the Oraita, because apparently even in the days of the Maharil, that's only the Rabbanan was already a saying. It's only the Rabbanan. So because of that, to forestall that, they had a cross, smach the ba'alma, was to bolster it, so no one would do that, but quiet, no one would denigrate, but quietly behind the scenes, they'd say to the students, it's really, of course, only the Rabbanan. The Isser Torah have Kedei shehamone ha'am, so that the masses, yechasvu shedash zot mikra ve'isser Torah have, that people would think it was an Isser Torah. But in all those cases, not Bal Tosif, unless you try to force to other people the idea, force upon them that this is really a matter of the oraita that you're teaching them. Umosif ala mitzvot lelo tam ubli lagalod lechol inyanos shiachmir b'divrem v'drosh v'chagor b'zeh. To give you a modern day example, is it a wise idea? The Rambam, according to the Maharil, he would say, you don't have to start announcing to the world that really eating fowl and dairy together is only derabbanan. Just tell them you don't eat milk and meat, and fowl is considered meat. You have to know that really that's not true, that really it's more nuanced than that. But the truth is, you can kind of, according to the Maharil's view, it seems like you can almost like fump it through if you're going to protect the system thereby. But the Rambam is saying, you must never teach. If you look at the Rambam contrast with the Maharil, you may not teach someone that's the Oraita. That would be a lie. That would be wrong. The Maharil is not saying to teach it wrong, just saying when you will mention that such and such a din d'Rabbanan is attached to a pasuk, people will think it's more serious, and that's good. That's good for observance. Yeah. Okay. I didn't answer one last piece, which is the sheet of the Raavad, which is these few lines here. George, go ahead.
So I think I answered my own question in my head, but I'll just. If it's considered a mnemonic device, if you actually have the specific words of the Torah, couldn't that be a slippery slope, or they could start saying, well, that hekesh or that zera shava is just a mnemonic device? But this is coming afterwards.
This is coming afterwards. Remember, that's why the language matters. There's a difference between a zera shava and a hekesh versus kra asmachta ba'alma. The word be'alma means, in this case, loosely translated, merely. It's merely an asmachta. As opposed to, even if the language of Chazal makes it sound like it is less than a hekesh or a gzera shava. Follow?
I think so, yeah.
But you're right. And there's potentially a slippery slope. Yeah, potentially. There could always be a slippery slope. People saying, this is made up and that's made up. We don't like this, we don't like that. Yeah. But this is sort of the architecture of the system is, again, leaving the Maharil aside about what you say publicly, what you don't say publicly. It's interesting. That was a concern over there. We didn't understand yet what the Raavad is really doing, because the Raavad was making this claim that the Rambam was going off the rails, but really he wasn't. The Rambam is just saying you can't falsify what you're teaching is the Oraita and the Rabbanan. We're trying to understand now what did the Raavad actually mean? Sully, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, but just to make it clear, generally when the Rabbanan made some kind of pronouncement, it was generally l'chumra.
Yes.
They can't go l'kula to the
right.
Torah. It's a l'chumra. So that's why they're saying it's only a Rabbanan, because it's actually more chumra than the Torah itself might require.
That's true if it's going to protect the system, and that's still extant, and examples abound. Later in later years, Kitniot, etc. for Ashkenazim. But, and this is back to George's point, from before, that's part of what we say when Mashiach Tzidkenu will arrive. One of the hallmarks of it is there be a Sanhedrin Gadol. I mean, I'm not suggesting in Chalila they're going to start abrogating mitzvahs, but it's not impossible that certain things will be revisited. The problem is people who were not of that stature at a time of Galus arrogated to themselves not only that power, that would have been egregious enough, but then started changing all the axioms completely. I was giving examples, the mitzvahs are just allegorical. The mitzvahs are simply, right, to teach us ethical lessons, but they're not actual mitzvahs from Hashem, etc. They're not really binding, all these different canards. So that's the point, though. In the interim, if it's for a protective purpose, asus yagel Torah, that the Chachamim can and in fact have done. Right. So here, if you want to stay for overtime, you can. If you got to run, I totally understand. We'll finish just till here, so we get the Raavad down pat, which is going to end with Tzarech in b'shitato. But Rav Asher Weiss is trying to understand. So what exactly is the Raavad so upset about with the Rambam? What does he actually hold? Yesh la'ayin b'shita Raavad. Imu modul b'shita Ramban. The Rambam ben Avad avar b'lav de Baal Tosif lo chilek ela al ma shekatav Rambam daf b'takana shetiknu gedoli yisol l'siag u'mishmeret yesh bo lav de Baal Tosif im amrushim natoru. So I have to try to understand the approach of the Raavad. Does he accept what the Ramban maintains? The Ramban said that when Yeravim ben Nevat made his own holiday, that was Baal Tosif, right? And what he's really arguing against the Rambam, and what the Rambam wrote, is that when the Chachamim Gedolei Yisrael made a takana to protect, Sally, like you were saying, l'chumra, maybe there's a lav of Baal Tosif if they claim that it's itself mideh oraita, or Shema Sover Haravid De'ain Baal Tosif Klal Ela B'Mosiv Mitzvah B'Sha'at Asiyata V'Lomosiv Al Mitzvah B'Hora B'Alma. Maybe, says Rav Asher Weiss, if you look carefully towards the Raavad, his view of Baal Tosif might be only one thing. Baal Tosif is when you mess with the object of a mitzvah. And it's not related at all to if you distort the system. And that's what he's arguing against the Rambam. Because the Rambam thinks the words lo tosifu ala davar, right? Lo tigru mimenu. Those words, according to the Rambam, have something to do with the system. And maybe what the Raavad is saying to the Rambam is, no, that is not about the system. It's about objects of mitzvah. Because maybe he is only going up against the part of the Rambam where he made this claim, and that's all he's really focused in on the idea that the Chachamim could say something and falsify how they represent what's midoraita and what's midorabanan, that's Baal Tosif. He doesn't really think that that's a problem of Baal Tosif. The Raavad doesn't think it's really an issue. Umashma derak betakana shehi kedat ukadin no ked Raavad de'ena over Baal Tosif mishum she'amar she'u min haTorah aval b'mosif chok shelo karoi uchi Yeravim ben Nevat be'emet over al Baal Tosif af l'shitato ach misof dvarav mashma k'tzat desfarad be'emet ein Baal Tosif el b'mosif be'etzem asira mitzvah dekatav lo timtza iser mosif el mitzvah aseh kigon lulav v'tfilin v'tzitzit v'chulei v'tzarach in b'shitato. Let me sum it up. I'm sorry. The hour is late. I see eyes glazing over, and with good reason. I sped through this. Rav Asher Weiss says the truth is it's very hard to understand what the Raavad is driving at here. At the beginning, the Raavad seems to be saying that he opposes what the Rambam has said because actually whatever the Chachamim would make an enactment of, they have the power to do it, sort of like the Rashba said, and they could never be Baal Tosif. He thinks that's... in fact, min haTorah. They have that power, and whatever they do, it can be elevated to be min haTorah. But if you made something up, if you like Yeravim ben Nevat, something out of whole cloth, maybe that really is Baal Tosif, because that's not misattributing what's the Rabban and what's the Oraita. It's making something up completely. That's the beginning of the Raavad. The end of the Raavad is, the truth is Baal Tosif is only on objects of mitzvah. But Yeravim ben Nevat did. That's not necessarily even Baal Tosif. It's not adding anything. That's just foolishness. That's fakery, but it's not Baal Tosif. Baal Tosif is to add specifically to a mitzvah. And he actually leaves it at Tzarech Iyun that it's very hard to understand what the Raavad is driving at. By the way, the Kesef Mishnah on that Rambam at the very beginning, the Kesef Mishnah himself kind of says, I don't really know what the Raavad is driving at. It sounds like what the Raavad is screaming about is exactly what the Rambam wrote. And the Radbaz gets in on the action. A lot of different people try to weigh in to try to understand what the Raavad was driving at. Anyway, that's all we have time for tonight. I hope you enjoyed and hopefully got something out of it as well. It wasn't too fast or too labyrinthine. But I tried tonight to give us not only the Shiltei Giborim, his approach based on sort of the progression through from the Rashba to the Pnei Yeshua to the Shiltei Giborim, which is not in chronological order, but sort of thematic order. And then to dial back to look at the Rambam, what does it mean conceptually? Can there be something called Baal Tosif in how you teach, in what you're teaching, how you understand mitzvahs, and the argument there, at least as understood by Rav Asher Weiss, of what the Rambam does in fact hold, which is that an asmachta is not really on the level of a deoraita. It's really only the Rabbanan as such. Okay, that's all we have time for tonight.